Good afternoon. My name is Vincent Wang. I'm a professor of political science and associate dean in the School of Arts and Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the lecture on Chinese democracy by Professor David Lorenzo. The topic today is obviously very important because scholars and policymakers have debated over the relationship between democracy and development for many, many years. Which one should go first? Should you pursue both simultaneously, or is one the precondition of the other? There are those people in the West who believe that political and economic liberty is indivisible, especially for those of us, those people who are used to capitalist democracy. They think of democracy as a precondition for capitalism, because capitalism, it depends on freedom, and it is the most dynamic form of economic system, has been historically credited for creating wealth. So that's obviously one view. But there's also a equally strong view in Asia. This is coined the so-called Asian values by leaders like Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew and the Chinese leaders that argue that democracy is really a luxury for developing countries. Instead, what is more important for countries in Asia is actually to develop their economy first. So obviously, this is, when we say ideas matter because they translate into policy, and you can see these forces at work. So the Asian values obviously today has been discredited because you have several countries, several Confucian societies that were culturally speaking very Confucian, but nonetheless they have developed a very competitive liberal political system, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The case of Taiwan is particularly important because this is a case of a Confucian democracy that makes obviously one think about the future of China, the much larger Chinese society. Samuel Huntington, the professor of political science who died a few years ago, whose Clash of Civilization I'm sure all of you have read, once said that, that he thinks that the toughest nut to crack is actually what he called the Islamic-Confucian nexus. So he's pretty pessimistic about the prospect of democracy in China. But we know that China accounts for 22% of the mankind. Whatever choices, economic choices, ecological choices, or political choices they make is going to shake our world. So we are very delighted to have David Lorenzo, who is going to lead us through a careful, but I would say seldom looked at aspect of explanation for democratization. The conventional wisdom is democratization happens as a result of either internal forces or external forces. Internal forces, the so-called third-way democratization theory, pay special attention to the interaction between the ruling party and the opposition party. And the external forces, they look at the global context, whether the Cold War had actually abetted a lot of the so-called right-wing dictators, and with the end of the Cold War, the changing attitude of the United States, that many countries, such as South Korea and Taiwan, were quote-unquote forced to democratize. David's contribution is actually to look at the internal forces, but he looked at some of the contrasting ideas among three important leaders in modern Chinese history. Sun Yat-sen, who was the founding father of modern Chinese Republic, who died in 1925. Chiang Kai-shek, who used to be the ruler of China, and then when he lost China, he went to Taiwan and ruled Taiwan until his death in 1975. And Jiang Jingguo, his son, who ruled from 1978 to 1988. So his was a very unusual attempt to look at what these three leaders wrote and spoke about democracy. Whether they have carried out democracy as they said. Of course, his lecture will give you will go into a lot of details on how their ideas matter in the democratization experience in Taiwan, which of course also hold lessons for contemplating the future of democracy in China. Dr. Lorenzo is associate professor in the College of International Affairs at National Zhengzhi University in Taiwan. This is our partner institution in Taiwan since 2000. And I will say that the NCCU is a very viable study abroad option. In many ways, it's like Taiwan, a good place to study traditional Chinese culture. In many ways, it's more traditional than China because they still use traditional characters. But on the other hand, it's very Western. Westerners go there, they will immediately become very familiar with the comfortable standard of living and also compatible political system. NCCU is excellent in studying Mandarin and business, social sciences, particularly if you have interest in the study of China and contemporary East Asia. Dr. Lorenzo previously taught at Virginia Wesleyan College, this is in Norfolk, and Jamestown College and University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. He is the author of 3 books. The book he is going to present on, Conceptions of Chinese Democracy, is the second book, published by the very prestigious Johns Hopkins University Press. The third book, Cities at the End of the World, using utopian and dystopian stories to reflect critically on our commitment and ways of life, will come out next year, so we wait eagerly. And he also wrote various articles, book chapters, and book reviews. He received a PhD in political science from Yale University, and it is our fortune because he actually happens to be visiting families in Washington, D.C. So I invited him to make the 90-mile trek to Richmond, and he's going back to Taiwan to teach. Their classes start next week. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for that very generous introduction, and thank everybody here for coming out to listen to this. I sort of put this together out of my book. It's sort of some thoughts, you might argue, that come out of the book. The book talks, as Professor Wang mentions, about democratization in Taiwan and the contributions of these 3 figures through democratic learning to Taiwan's democratic transition. Then at the very end, it talks a little bit about what's going on in mainland China. So what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about this connection between democracy and development, both in terms of Taiwan and the mainland, because as you'll see, there's a little bit of a puzzle here that might be a little more puzzling on the surface than it actually is underneath. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that to see how it turns out. Okay, so first I'll talk a little bit about democracy and development and a little bit about Taiwan's experience, particularly in terms of Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and Chen Jingkuo. A little bit of discussion on the Chinese mainland, and then a conclusion. So what I want to do first is to talk a little bit about the question that Professor Wang talked about at the beginning, and to get your initial thoughts on this. So if you ever take a course in IPE, or if you have, or if you will, or if you take courses in economic development, one of the central questions is the relationship between politics and economic development. And as time has gone on, increasingly the question has become democracy or development. What should the sequencing be? Is there an importance to the sequencing? Should they proceed simultaneously? Should one proceed before the other? So just to start out with, what are your initial thoughts? If you're a country, you're the decider, the great decider of a country, right? You're making all the decisions. What do you do first? Do you initiate political reform, political liberalization, and democratize the system, allow lots of people to participate, to throw in their 2 cents in terms of policy? Or do you engage in economic development first? Keep all the threads in your hands because you know what's going on, and proceed to industrialize your country, then maybe democratize. So what do you think? What are your initial thoughts on that? Yes?
I would think that development would come first as the country would want to specialize and take advantage of the comparative advantage. Then democracy would come. If you have democracy, then many people's interests sounds terrible, but may not allow for specialization.
Right.
And then development may not come after democracy.
Okay, so one argument is that democracy may in fact be detrimental to development, that there might be certain problems with allowing too many people to actually have a voice in policy making, right? So one of the arguments is you develop first, democracy can come afterwards. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, so that's an argument on the other side. Democracy advocates often argue that despite its many imperfections, eventually and in the long run, democracies tend to make better decisions because you have many more people participating in the policy-making process. And they have different experiences. They might have experiences that are closer to the actual workings of an economy. So therefore, it could very well be that if you democratize first, there is a better chance that you will actually develop. Okay, so there are arguments on both sides, right? And I'll go on and talk a little bit about, in a little more detail about what those arguments are. But first, we have to define some terms, right? If we're talking about democracy and we're talking about development, we have to know what it is exactly that we're talking about. And as we're going to see, the definition of democracy can be rather contentious and rather elastic. So what is democracy? Well, a very general definition is that it's a system of government in which those who make policies and decisions for the community and who generally use state power, and power is very important here, the state, its military, its police forces, its laws, are responsible to citizens, and citizens constitute the large majority of adult residents of the country. This means that officials are put in office by citizens, can be removed by citizens, and can be criticized by citizens. So a very important part of democracy is this whole notion of accountability. Officials are accountable to the general population. They can be removed from office by the general population. They're put in office by the general population. In terms of what is generally accepted as a democracy today, which is an indirect form. If you go way back to Greece, they had direct democracy, and so citizens and officials were overlapped a considerable amount. Okay, so democracy importantly has this whole notion of accountability. And that's going to be key for understanding a lot of these conceptions that we'll talk about later. Okay, development. And for those of you who are economists, sort of put your hands over your ears because this is a very rough and ready understanding of development. So development is a process by which an economy becomes more productive, importantly because it becomes more complex, there's an increase in economic activity, there is an increasingly complex set of economic structures, and importantly, in terms of a modern sense of development, there is industrialization. And what then accompanies this, generally speaking, is a rapidly rising gross domestic product and rapidly rising per capita income. Okay, so it's an economic process by which a country, in the parlance of 1960s political science, becomes modern. Okay, now that term is sort of freighted with all kinds of connotations, but people in some ways still think in those terms. Okay, so we talked about there could be a relationship here. There could be a relationship here in terms of sequencing, right? In terms of you democratize first and then industrialize or modernize or develop, or if you develop first, then democratize. So we talked about a few of the arguments. Let's go over a few more here. So what are the arguments for democratizing first? Well, again, we talked about accountability as being central. And so the first argument is you really have to hold officials accountable if they are going to engage in the kinds of activities you really want them to engage in and not cater to their own interests. So elected officials, because they are responsive to voters who have experience of how development is actually being carried out, right? They're not just people sitting in office buildings, they're actually engaged in these kinds of economic activities, make better decisions than officials who are not accountable. Accountability also helps eliminate corruption, in that corrupt officials can be voted out of office. So that's argument number one. Argument number two, and Professor Wong alluded to this in his opening remarks, there's an argument that there's a connection between democracies and free markets. That a liberal democracy, and we're going to differentiate a liberal democracy from other kinds of democracies, a liberal democracy tends to favor individual autonomy in both the political and economic systems, thus making for coherence across those two areas. If you conceive of development in capitalist terms. Now, if you don't conceive of development in capitalist terms, then that equation isn't going to hold. There's the argument that democratic countries tend to trade more with other countries than do authoritarian governments, and this is good. And finally, there's the argument that there's no guarantee that an authoritarian government that develops a country will actually give up its power. It could use the increased resources that have been developed in order to cling to power. So just because you develop doesn't necessarily mean, in this argument, you're going to democratize. Now, not everybody accepts all of these arguments, or even any of these arguments, and empirical proof for them is not always strong. So, for example, there are many instances we've seen of incompetent and corrupt officials who are continually voted into office. Right? You can see this in the United States, you can see this all over the world. And it's not only flaws in particular democratic systems that allow them to do this. Such political figures may deliver other types of goods to citizens, such as social services or pride or other kinds of goods, that voters may prize more highly than they do general competence and rectitude, right? So just because you have a democracy doesn't mean you're not going to have corrupt officials. So that's just one of the counter arguments that can be put to that particular set of reasons. Now, go to development first. What are the arguments about developing first? Well, the first argument is that development entails putting in place technical policies, and you got to get these right. And these technical policies are generally beyond the understanding of ordinary citizens. You know, do you really want, you know, Joe the hardware guy making decisions about whether or not you're going to engage in import substitution industrialization, or if you're going to do something else? Joe the hardware guy isn't going to understand that. So therefore, we need a technocracy, i.e. a government of experts, who are placed in power due to their knowledge, that is shielded from popular misunderstandings in order to implement the correct policies. Second, a government not controlled by the populace will be better able to withstand calls for changes in policies when problems arise, and problems are always going to arise. So what happens when problems arise? Everybody wants to shift course. And the argument is, well, if you have technocrats in power, they're going to say, well, this is the price you got to pay for development. Whereas if you have a democracy, you have to cater to these whims in order to be reelected. So, again, the argument is the general population may not be willing to endure tough times in order to enjoy rewards in the future, right? In other words, voters are like kids. You got to treat them like kids. They're not going to be able to understand that, you know, you got to go to bed early in order to wake up tomorrow, okay? So, in other words, this is a paternalistic argument, right? In fact, you could argue that most parts of these reasons are paternalistic. Third, democratization appears to be a natural process that accompanies development. Even during the first wave of modern development, those in the forefront, such as the US and Great Britain, were not full democracies in the sense that's accepted now. Therefore, two propositions. One, democracy appears to be related to a particular level of per capita income, and there is a lot of work that's being done on trying to find out exactly where the tipping point is. Signaling that such a level of resources is necessary for a successful democracy. Thus, a country must develop in order to reach the material conditions necessary for democracy. So this argument is you have to have a certain level of wealth in order to have a successful democracy. If you try to do it earlier, it's not going to work, right? So you have to develop first. You can't go into a really poor country and expect to institute a successful democracy, according to this line of argument. Second, if a country develops sufficiently, it will democratize as a matter of course. You develop and you get democracy. It's like a natural process, right? So this argument is, therefore, the first agenda item should be development, and development is more easily achieved through a technocracy. Again, while a premature democracy is likely to fail both politically and economically. Okay, so those are the arguments for development first, and you can see there's fundamental disagreement here, right? Okay, so both sets of arguments have been made forcibly by scholars. In particular, the argument about democratizing first has been extended to discussions not only of an initial development, but also with regard to more mature nations that are undergoing economic and political transitions. So for example, in the early 2000s, Jerry Huff wrote an influential book on Russia's transition, and I encourage you to read that if you're interested in these things. It's a very interesting book. Arguing that Russia's leaders after the fall of the Soviet Union got the political liberalization, economic liberalization sequence wrong by putting democracy first. Yeltsin and the other economic reformers he employed attempted to liberalize economics prematurely by rushing to institute market policies before they had sufficiently engaged in the type of political reform that would have created the institutions necessary to support a market economy. So that's actually a somewhat different argument. You need political liberalization to build institutions that actually support a market-based economy. And from that market-based economy, you therefore engage in development. So the result, Huff argues, was a failure of democratization and a warped development process. And if you were to bring Jerry here from Duke and stand him up in a room, he would say, see, I was right. Look at Russia, see that everything's screwed up. So Yeltsin and the others in the 1990s got it wrong. Okay, now, as was also mentioned before, Taiwan is held up, again, as a successful example of the authoritarian mode of development. The argument is that an authoritarian government headed first by Chiang Kai-shek, then his son Chiang Ching-kuo, put in place a particular set of development policies that combined American foreign aid, a large state sector, a set of import substitution industrialization, and export-led industrialization policies. And they said, this is the way it's going to be. And there was negotiation on the margins, but the government was strong enough to say, this is the way that we're going to go. That's the way the argument goes. Now, I think the reality was a little more complex, but that's the way the argument goes. Only after those policies had proved successful and Taiwan had taken its place as one of the Asian tigers did government officials finally acquiesce to the institution of a liberal democracy in the late 1980s. And voila, what do you have now? You have a flourishing liberal democracy, right? But it was built on, the argument goes, the achievements of this authoritarian government who engaged in the tough task of development. Now, to bring back other people, if we were to resurrect Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, put them in this room, they would say, no, you got it wrong. That's not the way things worked. In their view, democracy should come before development, and for the most part, Taiwan had democratized before it developed, which means they have a different understanding of democracy than than people are using now. So again, for them, Taiwan is a story of successful democratic development. For some, such a sequence, democracy then development, is correct because only a democratic China could embark on the transformational projects it had to undertake. Now, he was writing in the 19-teens, 1920s, and actually even before the revolution, so he's talking about resisting imperialism economically reconstructing the nation, and generally remaking China as a whole. And he said, in order to do that, you've got to have a democracy. You can't do that without a democracy. Now, democracy in Sun's understanding is not necessarily a liberal democracy. Now, that's not necessarily controversial. Scholars have identified different strains of democracy, and I would recommend David Hell's book on models of democracy as a place that you might want to go if you're interested in this. What Sun wanted for China, and again, this is before World War II, before the Civil War and everything else. He's talking about mainland China, was something that was quite a bit different from liberal democracy. So what are we talking about when you're talking about a liberal democracy? Liberal democracy is one in which it is assumed that citizens will possess very different interests and political values. Such a democracy entails the use of a constitution, the law, and courts to temper and constrain majorities from instituting policies that could harm minorities. So such a democracy contains protections regarding speech, assembly, general political participation. It importantly views the political system as competitive and sees elections as contests among multiple political parties, each of which puts forward its own agenda to voters. Okay? So liberal democracy privileges individualism, privileges individual rights. It talks about a competitive multi-party political system. Now, Sun was not in favor of that. He thought this liberal democratic model created a weak state that was shackled by too many safeguards and could do little to mobilize citizens. States are not inherently dangerous in his understanding, as he argues a liberal democratic understanding paints them. The Western liberal suspicion of states is a product of Western history and is not applicable to China. He has this understanding that the state historically in China has been relatively weak. Now, there are people who are sort of on both sides of that debate, but he was definitely on the side of, most people in China historically possessed a great deal of negative freedom because the reach of the national government really didn't extend that far. So he argued it was not the state but the monopolization of power by families that created danger. Western liberal states also put too much emphasis on individualism. China is fragmented and has all the individualism it could stand. What is needed is more unity and solidarity in the form of nationalism. So Sun's understanding of democracy was driven by a string of observations. That China requires a strong state in order to engage in the type of projects that will ensure its survival. That democracy is the only form of government that can make a strong state possible and controllable. But also that only the fullest development of democracy in a form not yet seen in the West would make possible such a strong popular state. So drawing upon both China's particular context and his own understanding of human nature, Sun argued that democracy must not be liberal and pluralist, but elitist, unitary, and mobilizational. Okay, that's actually some of the stuff I was just talking about. So for Sun, the tasks China faced demanded the backing and participation of the entire community. Authoritarian governments that enjoy support from only a narrow group of people who monopolize power for their own benefits are not suitable for this task. Democracy is a type of government that expresses the will of all the people is alone capable of gaining the loyalty, trust, and support of all citizens. And it alone is capable of controlling the powerful state that is essential to accomplish these big tasks. But in order to take advantage of the power of citizens, state officials must lead them aggressively. They can't be passive. They can't just follow the unguided will of citizens. So there's a tension in Sun's understanding of democracy as a popular form of the state, which in his model incorporates some participatory elements, as we'll see, and his understanding of democracy is just another political form that must take into account the nature of political work and the unequal characteristics of humans. Sun was a Democrat who believed in the radical inequality of humans. Now, in the West, those two things just don't compute. Our understanding of democracy generally is that a democracy is good and it's right and it's necessary because in some way everybody's equal. If, at the very least in terms of the equal respect that everybody must have, or the equal autonomy they must have over their own personal lives, unless you are underage or in some way incapacitated, right? But Sun was in many ways a radical inegalitarian. He did not think that people were at bottom equal. So, to elaborate on this, an elitist democracy is necessary in Sun's view because people are highly different in their abilities. Humans range from sages to inferior people. Only those with the highest abilities and trained in relevant subjects should be eligible to be officials. Ordinary citizens are to choose among such highly trained people and hold them accountable only in the most general sense by setting national goals, voting in elections, and in some circumstances participating in recalls, referenda, and initiatives. Otherwise, elites elected to office are to have a free hand in creating policies. Citizens are to defer to their expertise in creating the means by which the community's goals are to be attained, in the same way that a passenger in a taxi defers to the local knowledge of a driver to deliver him to his preferred destination. And that's exactly the analogy that he uses. Citizens are passengers in a car, officials are the drivers of the car, they know the correct routes. And it's stupid for passengers to argue about the driver with regard to the correct route. It's the driver who has the expertise. This is also a unitary rather than a pluralist understanding of democracy, both in terms of interest and knowledge. Sun assumed that the community as a whole has a will that is expressed by means of elections and which is implemented by the utilization of objective technical knowledge. He does not appear to envision the presence of multiple organized parties that cater to different interests, values, or ways of understanding the world. Instead, he appeared to think of electoral choices in terms of selections among groups within a single party that are differentiated by different levels of competence. Elections, in his understanding, appear most likely to take the form of plebiscites held to judge the abilities of those sitting in office. If officials are incompetent, they should be thrown out. It is not a mere majority who rules here, nor are elections necessarily decided upon the basis of choices among different policies. Rather, it is the community as a whole that chooses or discards leaders based on their judgment of the technical expertise of sitting officials, just as a passenger would hire or fire a cab driver based on his judgment of the driver's ability to get him to a destination. If you say, take me, to the Excelsior Hotel, and he takes you to the Holiday Inn, well, you fire him, right? That's sort of the level of accountability that Sun was talking about. But while the taxi driver is on the road, you don't question him until he brings you to the wrong destination. Then you fire his butt, right? But not before. That's sort of the gross understanding that he thought ordinary citizens would have. And again, notice, interests are unitary, knowledge is unitary, knowledge is technical. So in the same way that you don't have open-ended debates about how it is that you construct a particular kind of bridge, because the inputs are technical. Now again, that's to oversimplify, but that's Sun's understanding. In the same way, it's not necessarily to have policy debates. Policies are grasped by technical knowledge, not by opinion. Now, finally, Sun alludes to the proposition that democracy should be mobilizational. The reason for creating a democracy is to harness the energy and will of the entire community behind a national task at hand. It's not enough that the government be popular only in the sense that it continues in power through elections. It must be capable of using the populace's energy and will, directing the population to particular tasks of national importance, rather than allowing individuals to fritter away their energies in purely selfish activities. This means empowering the government to, for example, draft people to work on particular projects, to engage in activities that other understandings would leave to the market, and to teach and indoctrinate the population in the virtues of patriotism and nationalism. Okay, so this is, again, to underline the point, this is not liberal democracy. However, he says it is democracy, and according to some definitions, in fact it is. It depends on how persuaded you are by the mechanisms of accountability that Sun puts into this model. In the book, I cast a little bit of doubt upon that, but I don't dismiss it as a kind of democracy just because it's not liberal democracy. Okay, Chiang Kai-shek adopted many parts of Sun's understanding of democracy. Now again, he's going to be the person in power throughout most of Taiwan's developmental history, all the way up until 1975. He argued for the necessity of allowing officials the scope to pursue policies without interference from the populace after they'd been elected, and elected through a procedure in which his party was the only major political force, by the way. There were other little minor parties, but they were very small, and you could stand for election to the national legislature as an independent. And a surprising number of independents actually won, but they were at a severe disadvantage. And you could criticize the government during the campaign, but after the campaign, you might be prosecuted for criticizing the government. So, again, this is not a liberal democracy. He argued for unity and a communal will molded not by democracy itself and nationalism, as was Sun, but through a universal adherence to traditional Chinese and particularly Neo-Confucian moral values. He was also in favor of mobilization through government leadership. It was through these means that Taiwan would become a model province in terms of economic development and provide a base for which the Republic of China would once again be the government of China as a whole. That was his other big project. So democracy in these understandings is a process that entails vigorous effort on the part of the state and a political party to ready citizens for the responsibilities of democratic life and to guide the nation in its engagement in large projects. Even in its developed form, it entails the delegation of large powers to government officials. Therefore, in their understanding of Sun and Chiang Kai-shek in particular, what others took as Taiwan's authoritarianism was really A, the result of the state and party preparing Taiwan for democracy, and B, the workings of democracy, which necessarily entails the assumption of important powers by officials, deference to expertise, and the privileging of unity and knowledge over pluralism. Okay, so you see, if you accept this point of view, you sort of squared the circle. You can have democracy before development because democracy can deliver the things that were otherwise imputed to authoritarianism. Okay, it's getting a little late, so I'm going to skip over the contemporary Taiwan stuff. Okay, so what's going on in the PRC? And this is a very, very light overview. Okay, people who speak of democracy in the PRC are divided into two camps, both of which are interested in the role of democracy in development. Okay, well, I skipped this, but this, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Chih-kuo. Okay, people associated with the Chinese Communist Party tend to adopt, now this isn't everybody. Wen Jiabao actually talked a little bit about democracy in a more liberal sense than this, but I'm not going to talk that much about him. I'm pretty much going to attribute a liberal understanding of democracy to democracy activists rather than Wen Jiabao. People associated with the Chinese Communist Party tend to adopt an understanding that is importantly reminiscent of Sun's in the Unitarian and elitist conceptions they champion. They hold that democracy is possible in the context of a single dominant party. Those most closely associated with the CCP argue that intra-party democracy, democracy within the party, is the form best fitted for the current Chinese context. Here the argument is that multiple parties vying for power is neither necessary for democracy nor desirable for China. So long as a political system features leaders who are selected by others rather than deriving power from heredity or the use of force, and B, are subject to term limits, they say, you got a democracy. Now, the emphasis here is also on expertise and unity. Mobilization isn't quite as important as it was in the past. In the 50s and 60s, mobilization was very important. It's not so important anymore. The ideology of the party it has held is proof of a higher level of knowledge and an expert status among membership. Development and other tasks require knowledge unavailable to ordinary citizens. Thus, it is best that only members of the party be eligible to hold important leadership positions and that they be entrusted with large powers to guide the nation through the modernization process. Unity is also important. Arguments against a liberal multi-party model of democracy hold that multi-party elections will divide the population into winners and losers. And this is explicitly cited in several things that I saw. They said, you have an election, well, one party wins, the other party loses. What about the people who lose? They're going to be disaffected, they're going to be unhappy, they're not going to go along with whatever policies are chosen. So, winners and losers, thus creating dissatisfaction and alienating a significant portion of the population. Also important is the geographical unity of the country. The fear is that, A, the loss of overall unified support for the state will lead to its weakening, so they're also afraid of a weak state, and thus its inability to rein in breakaway movements, and B, that parties may take on a regional identity and thus also foster this breaking up of China. Here, the negative example of the Soviet Union is invoked, and the prospect of a Chinese Gorbachev is fearfully rejected. They don't want a Gorbachev. They said, look what happened to the Soviet Union. You know, one day you're a superpower, the next day, you know, the Americans are giving you aid. Yeah, no, that's not what they want. The population should not be invited to divide itself. Rather, they should be encouraged to rally around a single set of leaders, and in so doing, identify themselves fundamentally as citizens of the PRC, rather than members of a political party or inhabitants of a geographical region. Now, democracy advocates such as Liu Xiaobo, Yu Keibing, dismiss these arguments. They hold that the incompetence, unresponsiveness, and corruption of the Communist Party both threaten China's development and its unity. So they say it's not multi-party democracy that's a threat to Chinese unity, it's the monopolization of power by the Chinese Communist Party. Inter-party democracy is not enough. Competition among parties in the form of choices among different policy platforms is the best way to move forward the development project. Holding officials accountable through truly competitive elections will help solve the problems of incompetence, unresponsiveness, and corruption, all of which are greater threats to China's geographical unity than would be the workings of a pluralist political system. The greater the flexibility and the more freedom people have to air grievances and act on their political understandings, the more content they will be to live in a nation that is so large in terms of geography and population. Such democracy advocates also reject the elitist assumptions held by the promoters of inter-party democracy, and in fact turn those assumptions on their heads. It is ordinary people who hold collectively the type of knowledge necessary to inform and guide development strategies, not experts. Ordinary citizens' direct experiences with the effects of development strategies and policies are crucial. It is the absence of such knowledge from the policymaking process that accounts for the mistakes, imbalances, wastes, and tragedies of China's current economic scene. So the debate on the mainland appears to be about types of democracy and their relationship to development. Arguments generally associated with authoritarian development are invoked to keep power with the Communist Party under the guise of inter-party democracy, or, quote, democracy with Chinese or socialist characteristics. Those arguments associated with development in the context of democracy are now invoked by dissidents who are pushing for a liberal, multi-party understanding of democracy, and they look mainly to the West for inspiration and liberal democracy as a model. Okay. So to conclude, these observations tell us that the relationship between democracy and development can be more complicated than even the current understandings hold. It's not just the fact that democratizing first or developing first has various advantages. We also see that understanding that relationship might be importantly influenced by how we understand democracy. Democracy itself does not come in just one model or conception. However, it's not infinitely elastic. So I would argue the concept of inter-party democracy is not sufficient because it lacks the essential element of accountability to all citizens defined broadly. Now, importantly, we can see that if democracy is defined in an elitist and unitary fashion, democracy advocates can claim for democracy some of the advantages that are associated with authoritarian governments. Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek would certainly do so and argue that the type of government found in Taiwan before the late 1980s was either a democracy or a form of government well on the road to democracy. If we accept that definition, it would be claimed that democracy came first in Taiwan, and therefore the democracy first people would have that country in their column. But it's also clear that many people do not accept and are not willing to settle for such a definition. They would argue that Taiwan before the late 1980s and in the PRC currently were and are authoritarian governments, and that such governments ought to be changed for a variety of reasons. Current democracy activists in the PRC argue that the, at best, very limited understanding of democracy now in place is impeding China's economic development. They're looking for a breakthrough like that which occurred in Taiwan in 1987, which set in motion a process by which Taiwan became a multi-party liberal democracy. They do not agree that a weak system of accountability or a one-party democracy is sufficient to provide the type of information necessary for successful development. They also reject the notion that any one party or ideology has a monopoly on knowledge, or that the kind of knowledge that you need for policy making is purely technical. Too many purely political choices must be made between investment and consumption, on where to invest, on the nature of social services, for economic experts to be given total sway. For them, the PRC is not the poster boy for successful authoritarian or one-party democratic economic development, as is Singapore. Rather, is a showcase for the problems of authoritarian development, and they want liberal democracy to be instituted sooner rather than later. Finally, we see that the dynamics of the debate over democracy in the PRC continue to be those found in the earlier debate about democratization versus development. For all the talk of democracy with Chinese characteristics and other attempts to carve out an essentially Chinese or Asian understanding of democracy, politics, and the state, the future of China will probably be defined in terms of the two fundamental positions regarding the role of experts in government that was first fully articulated by Plato in the Republic, which Robert Dahl talks about in his book, Democracy and Its Critics, and has been replicated in the debates over development and democracy since the early 20th century. So, just to sum up the two positions, one position is that superior training and intelligence of experts makes them best fitted for power. Their knowledge will lead to success. Their professionalism will allow them to resist populist temptations to do the popular but wrong thing. And the objective nature of technical expertise they possess will wipe out all differences of opinion and judgment, allowing the government to speak with a single voice and unite the population behind it. The other position argues that it's the collective experience and wisdom of ordinary citizens that provides the best guidance. And while it's not the case that everyone can exercise official powers, when officials are accountable to the population, they are forced to reflect in their policy decisions the inevitable pluralism and interests that exist in the population and which importantly shape the context of such large projects as economic development. Thanks.